and welcome for all of you joining in. My name's Michelle. I'm TC Fit Trainer Michelle. I've also got Kendall and Kelsey on the line here. We are talking fitness walking today, so let the good times stroll. I love those little catchy things to get us moving. As we give everybody just another minute or two, I'm going to open it up to Kelsey or Kendall or anyone on the call. I would love to hear some of your favorite routes for walking. Where do you guys go? Whether you head just outside your door or you drive to a location. Kelsey, I know you're clear on the west end of town. Where do you go?
Well, if time is short, we just hit up our neighborhood and walk around there. I'm in Medina. There's not a whole lot of walking trails out here yet, but we are close to Baker Park, and so which is part of Three Rivers, so that's always really great. And Lake Rebecca, they have a lot of great trails around there. So if you're looking for scenic places out in the west area, Baker Park and Lake Rebecca, I would highly suggest.
Is Lake Rebecca paved trails or like wooded or that type of thing?
I think it's a combination.
Okay.
Yeah.
I've never been to Lake Rebecca.
Kendall, you're on kind of the cities in the south side. What's around you?
So I'm very lucky, and I actually have Lake Nokomis about 4 blocks away. So our route, it usually takes us about 5 minutes to walk down to the lake, and then we'll have a route where we either go halfway around the lake, or depending on time, if we have more time, it usually takes about an hour and 15 minutes to get around. But that's kind of our path. But I love taking walks around the lake. There's just something about it.
The lake is nice in that it kind of forces you can't stop and just cut across. So you have to do the whole loop. I'm seeing, is it Hussett Park or Hussett Park? So that's a nice one. Lebanon Hills, that one's on my list. So I'm kind of on the Hopkins, Minnetonka part of town. But Lebanon Hills is one I will drive to. I can also say only because of the COVID did I think about heading down south to Fort Snelling, which I think is a great one. It's relatively flat, but lots of nature to see there. And if you happen to be on this Hopkins side of town, Lone Lake Park is one of my favorites. You head down into kind of a gully and there's a lake. And I think they've added some biking trails. So while around Lone Lake is mostly hiking and walking, you can connect from that park into other parks with your bike. So that's a good one. Oh, another Lone Lake. Yay. Part of walking, is having that adventure, and just being able to talk to people and find new places is a great way to make that happening. So I think we're here at 11:05. We've already kind of started, but jumping in, I'm just checking my notes here. So we want to hear from you. If you have questions, please throw them in the chat box today. And as we move through the discussion, don't hesitate to share your resources for successful walking. That's why we're all here. So this is good. Kelsey, I'm going to throw a question out to you. When someone is new to walking or returning to exercise, do you have any tips or exercise prescriptions that you share with them so they get started safely?
Sure. So, rule of thumb, just start, easy and start maybe with, depending on where you are, up to a mile or a half a mile or whatnot, and just start easy and gradually into it. After you walk, maybe the first day, take note of how you're feeling the next day. How do your feet feel, your knees, your hips and all that? Like, are you feeling achy? Maybe that was too much too soon, and then you can dial back a little bit. But I know, especially on these nicer days, we want to just get out and just walk and go. But then we can get a little too far from your place, and then end up having a long route ahead of you. But just say kind of, start slow and progress, 10% mileage on a weekly basis or whatnot, up to 10%, and have good quality shoes to help support you during your walk.
Yeah. I usually say start with 10 minutes.
Okay.
That's kind of a baseline, and then you can always build up from there. I heard you mention the 10% rule. So that's a tough thing to do, to minimize that and only increase by 10% each week, but that's a guideline. And especially as your time or your mileage increases, that's an option for monitoring your intensity or increasing intensity. I see a question out here. I'm going to send this to Kendall. Kendall, when it comes to stretching, should we be stretching before or after our walking, and how does that play into warm-ups?
Well, typically with stretching, I'd say always after a workout stretch. And, there's a difference between more of that static stretching and dynamic. And we talk about this during our fitness classes too. Dynamic warm up is kind of like stretching minus holding the pose for a long period of time. So let's say, if you're wanting to warm up your hamstrings, the back of your legs, hinging forward from your hips, hold it there for about 3 to 4 seconds and then switching. Really, it's just to kind of prep your body for movement. So yes, you can definitely warm up before walking, and it also depends on how fast you're walking. A leisurely walk, you don't need to do it. But, if you're going at a faster pace and getting more of the arm movements in there, warming up through your ankles and doing some ankle pumps or some hip swivels through your hip. And like Kelsey said, I think a big thing with getting into a walking routine is investing in a good pair of shoes, because if you're finding that you're sore through your shins and through your ankles, maybe you're just wearing the wrong shoes. So kind of investigating into your gait and having someone looking at how you're walking, that'll help as well. So
that's great. So quick summary on that. If you're just going for a casual walk, warming up is maybe less important. But if you're looking at fitness walking or intensifying your workout, then yes, add that warm up in before you get started. And ideally, probably save your stretching, your true static stretching, for after your walk. Mm-hmm. 2 thumbs up. Thanks, Kendall. And that kind of takes us into our next segment here, which is thinking about how do we take our walking into that fitness level? How do we intensify? Kelsey, I'm going to send that off to you. And if you have any thoughts on weights during your walking, give us an update on that.
Sure. I would not recommend weights when walking. It can throw off your gait, and typically when you're holding weights and walking, you're using more momentum anyways than you are like really strengthening your muscles. So I would avoid it and just use your body weight, pump your arms, or even invest in like Nordic walking poles. And that can get a lot of tricep and upper back muscles engaged when you're working against the poles. So I would avoid the weights and get poles instead.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Agree.
That's what Kendall, I see you agreeing. I agree too. No, we see these images of people wearing ankle weights. No, not for walking. If you're doing a strength training workout where maybe you're going to do a leg exercise for 1 or 2 minutes, then we can talk about that. But when we're talking about 10, 20, even an hour of walking, ideally weights in the hands or the ankles, we would save that for our strength training routine. If you are training, I saw somebody's going on like a backpacking adventure. You do want to prepare for that, and maybe a weighted vest or something that's going to keep the weight really close to your center of gravity. That would be one way to train for that, increase your intensity. I'm also a big fan of hills. Anywhere that you can find hills or maybe some steps to work in to your workout, that can bring the heart rate up. Kendall, what about pushing a stroller? Do you feel like that's an intensity?
Oh yeah, definitely a stroller. And if, especially when there's a child in the stroller, yeah, absolutely. That adds, depending on how heavy your kid is, it adds that weight, especially, when we talk about doing hills, that adds a lot more challenge for your calves, your quads, gets your heart rate up faster. And I have gone out running with my daughter. Me personally, I'm not a huge fan of it just because your arms are, kind of fixated at a point. But There's nothing wrong with it. It's your preference. But yeah, absolutely, adding a stroller can definitely add more challenge to it.
Kelsey, any other thoughts on increasing your heart rate or where our heart rate should be when we're walking?
Well, it depends on your fitness level and whatnot. So ideally, if you are going for a shorter paced, more power walking, fitness walking, then maybe increasing your heart rate a little bit higher. Anywhere, if we're looking at an RPE from 1 to 10, perhaps, being between 5 to 8 or something if for a shorter duration. And if you're going for a longer time, more endurance, then perhaps bringing it down anywhere from 3 to 5 or 6. And RPE is your rate of perceived exertion. We can post, when we post the recording, we'll put the chart up, but it's just a scale of 1 to 10 to help you monitor kind of how you're feeling in your heart rate as well. Yeah. And then adding hills, pumping your arms. Music also plays a big factor in it. And I have some information here. So, if you want to pair your music to the beat that you're walking, that could be kind of fun as well. ACE, which is your American Council on Exercise, they recommend if you truly want to do some power walking, anywhere from 137 to 139 beats per minute. Beats per minute, your BPMs, that'll keep you on beat with your walking. And, if that's too fast, you can dial it down. If you were to Google online, walking with a beat or something like that, there's a lot of charts that will come up, and perhaps we can post this as well. If you know your time per mile, then it tells you the beats per minute that you can try to search for either on Spotify or Apple Music. You can Google songs and their BPM, and then hopefully that'll keep you kind of on track to keep going nice and quick and keep your heart rate up.
I think that's a good tip, Kels, because, I a lot of questions that I get as a trainer is, well, how do I know, if I'm running on a treadmill, how can I gauge to see how fast I'm going on a treadmill versus outside, because it's hard to gauge. So the beats per minute, that's a good tool to use.
Yeah, and we use that a lot in fitness classes. So like my steppers out there, you might be familiar with it. We usually step 130 beats per minute. 130 beats per minute will give you around a 17-minute mile. So, if you want to go faster than that, then increase your BPMs. If you want to go slower, you can decrease and whatnot. But again, music is motivation. So find your favorite songs and make a fun playlist.
Mm-hmm.
Kelsey, that's great. I just put that 17-minute mile note in the chat box. And then also I did share an RPE chart. So from 1 to 10, rate of perceived exertion, how you're feeling. I see Matt out there. He kind of mentioned the weighted vest again. And so Matt, if you're on the call, I'm curious if you have any tips or specific vest, or is it okay if I just use a backpack and throw some weights in it?
Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think the weighted vest works a little bit better simply because it is close to your body. I think if you made a good point, if you're training for a backpacking event, that a backpack's going to be better. But I think the weighted vest, I bought one when my daughter had a hand injury so she could keep lifting. And I found it pretty helpful. In fact, I've been using it a little bit for my 12-30-30 Kendall on the treadmill to increase that difficulty. And I've enjoyed it. Now, where I think that the weights wouldn't be helpful are for people that maybe are struggling with some arthrosis or osteoarthritis in their knees. You don't want to add any more load to that knee. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it because there can be some benefits to that, but just being mindful of adding more weight and how your knees are feeling especially if you're beginning a program or if you're ramping a program up. Those are the deficits I see.
So I think a lot about when I'm trying to increase my heart rate, I try to walk faster. And there's this really fine line between where my walk turns into my run. And I want to try to avoid overstriding. Matt, do you have any thoughts on that? I'm going to share an image if you can see it. How can we make sure we're not overstriding, or how do we measure that when we're walking?
Well, I think simply looking at what I don't And I tend to, when I see people in clinic for running injuries or walking injuries, I'll watch them on a treadmill, and I can see these things. And I understand from a running standpoint how you're overstriding. Walking, I think it's a little bit more difficult to do that. However, I don't tell people to walk or run differently. What I'll just tell them is to increase their cadence, and that's how many steps you take. You guys were alluding to that, how many steps you take in a minute. And I feel like where you want that first ground reaction force, your first contact with the ground, is in that green section where that the picture shows the guy running, or with the green. The red is he's overstriding. I think with walking, for the most part, you're going to be fairly safe, just because the ground reaction forces aren't quite as impactful as when you're running. That's why walking sometimes is as beneficial or more beneficial than running, especially as we age, right?
Mm-hmm. And with walking, that heel strike rolling through the full foot versus running, where we tend to land closer to the ball of the foot.
You're correct. Well, most people running overstriding can increase injuries. There's some literature behind that. So like I said, usually when you increase cadence, then you diminish that overstriding. I just don't think it's probably as much of an issue when you're walking.
Sure. That's great. Helpful for sure. I'd be curious to know, for the audience out there, are there any aches, pains, injuries, things that you're feeling with your walking that we can try to solve? Or a few weeks ago, we did a forum on shoes, so I can share that link as well. That's out there if you're looking for running or walking shoes.
Michelle, I have a few tips when it comes to. I saw a potential question about shin splints and walking injuries, and typically when we get injured, especially walking, it's too much, too soon, and maybe it's usually training errors, meaning you are in improper footwear. You're walking in an area that maybe you're walking too much on hard surfaces, or walking the same direction around a track and not reversing that, or you're just doing too much too soon. So that 10% rule, I think is very good to adhere to diminish injuries, but also footwear. And I would tell you that most of the time I send people to local running stores where they can get fit properly. You can watch that recording from our last session with the footwear, and I think most running shoes are equally good as walking shoes as well. Mm-hmm. So especially if you're dealing with some sort of injury, or again dealing with some joint arthrosis or arthritis, that finding a good shoe is going to be very, very helpful, and then switching that shoe up frequently as well. We usually say about 500 miles, give or take, but depends on how hard you are on your shoes, and are you dedicating those shoes to that program. And so what I will typically do is write the date that I buy my shoes on the tongue on the inside, and then I can kind of gauge how much I've been walking or running and determine when that that 500 miles is.
That's helpful. We have a question from Christine. When counting steps, how do we know how many steps we take in a mile? Kelsey or Kendall, how do you gauge steps per mile?
So there's typically, and Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, but a typical person's stride length is 2 to 2.5 feet long, I guess. Probably it could be shorter based on height and leg height and whatnot. So 2,000 steps is 2,000 steps is 1 mile roughly, and then 10,000 steps is your 5 miles. So that's
I do think we're painting with a broad brush with that too, just because there's a lot of factors, but I think that's a general guideline you can follow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I would agree. I've heard that before, that 2,000 steps. So that's kind of where I go if I'm not using a tracking device.
Mm-hmm. And roughly it takes, again, this is average, but about 20 minutes for a mile.
Yep, that 3 miles per hour. And that's where sometimes I try to push towards the 4 miles per hour, and I want to make sure you can only go so fast before you feel like you break into a run.
Yeah. An awkward jog/fast run.
Hopefully I'm not walking with somebody with short legs, because then it Any thoughts on socks? Which socks we should be wearing when we're walking or running for that matter? Matt, do you want to jump in with this? I can say.
Sure, I will. Well, you want something that's going to wick and something that's going to form fit. There are specialty running socks, and they're probably a little bit more expensive. I think just generally, again, painting with a broad brush, a lot of the cotton socks that will bunch up a little bit and can cause some blisters. Another tip is when you're buying shoes is to buy your shoes late in the day because our foot does swell. And so you get a proper fit, but also buy those shoes with wearing the socks that you're going to wear for that activity. So I do think, a good running sock, synthetic fibers, people can talk about the benefits of, wool, that merino wool that's popular with like smart wool socks and different types that way. I just think you want something synthetic as that's going to wick and be fit to you. So you're not wearing, your husband's or your kid's socks. If you have a smaller foot, you don't want that thing to bunch up.
Yeah, I don't like the price point on these, but the smart wools, the darn toughs, I am surprised at how much I like the wicking socks. They make a difference. Mm-hmm. We are coming up on the end of our 25 minutes, so I just want to throw it out there. Last chance for questions, or you could always reach out to the trainers individually or at our shared account, fitness.center@genmills.com. I'm going to do one more spin around here, looking for tips for motivation. So how do we stay motivated with our walking? Kendall, going to you first.
Well, I think when COVID first hit, both my husband and I were doing a pretty good job of taking a walk every day at 10 a.m. And then both of us just got busier and busier, and it kind of fell off. Now that we're coming into spring again, I always tell people to set a reminder on your calendar, set aside time. This is when you're going to do it. Even if it's a 10-minute walk, something is better than nothing. So schedule time to do it. Get yourself into a habit.
I would agree. Even when I think about my weekends, I almost plan out which park or which route I'm going to take in advance. So that way there's no question. I just go do it. Mm-hmm. Kelsey, you're up.
I was going to say music for sure. And my kids keep me and us active. So we always like to check out new parks, and then we go on a little creature adventure looking for, animal prints and other fun things that we might find on. It's not necessarily power walking with them, but it's something, or it's a jog, it's either one. And then Ellen, I see your question here about walking sticks. How do you know if they're correct length? It depends on your height. But I think most of those Nordic walking poles would come with instructions, but you want to make sure that your arm stays long here and that you're just kind of gliding the pole. We can help with that offline and whatnot, but you want to have your arms long and pump through your shoulders versus your elbows.
Yeah, if she's talking about Nordic walking, I do believe the general rule, if I remember we brought some people in for events in the past, it was kind of that when the pole's down on the ground, that you want kind of 90 degrees at your elbow around there. I believe that's what they said. Don't quote me on that. I'm not a Nordic walking expert, but I think that's what they talked about when they were here.
Yeah, keeping the shoulders away from the ears. So nothing where you're hunching up here.
Right. And then a tip I think as well for me, just for staying motivated, is I think it goes back to goal setting for fitness. And that is, set a goal, stick to it, let other people know, be that your family, maybe your spouse, your loved ones that maybe will go with you, so when you're not feeling up to it, that they'll encourage you to go, hey, we want to get you 3 times this week, Dad. So I think that letting people know so they keep you accountable and better yet, have them be involved with that. I think that's a good way to stay motivated as well, so you don't disappoint those others and yourself. I think that's what's always helpful for me, at least.
Yeah, 3 cheers for the buddy system, whether it's your kids or your friends. And even if you're just talking to other people about it, Matt, that's kind of what you were saying. You don't always have to walk together, but that accountability and knowing that somebody's going to ask is helpful. I always like looking for interesting things while I've been walking, there is a 5-foot dinosaur not quite downtown, but close to downtown Hopkins. I won't tell you where. You're going to have to walk the neighborhoods to find it. I see Lorelei picks up random trash along the way. That's great. Plus, you can work on your squats while you're doing that. So use good form as you're bending over. And look for different events, whether it's the philanthropy and the 5K walks. There's National Get Outdoors Day coming up June 12th. So the state parks will be free on those days. I love this walk your dog. That's always a good one. And that's what we've got for you today. So thank you so much for joining in. And yes, this will be recorded. You can always find it on Teams, or I should say for the next 30 days, you can find it on Teams. We're also going to post it on Yammer. That's Wellness and Fitness MPLS. So we'll get that out there. And we will hope to see you in 2 weeks. Our next segment coming up is, I'm finding the date for you here. It's going to be May 19th, Breathing for Better Health. So we'll do some breathing exercises and talk about getting the oxygen into our body. So thank you so much for joining us. Have a great rest of your Wednesday, Cinco de Mayo.
Woohoo!